So if you recall, we talked about the scientific revolution. If you remember Copernicus and Galileo and how they were challenging the church and talking about the sun, as you see here, as the center of the universe rather than the earth. And it wasn't just Newton or Sir Francis Bacon and Galileo and Copernicus that were challenging things. There were other philosophers like Rene Descartes, Immanuel Kant, and a lot of others, John Locke, and a lot of other thinkers that were challenging things, not just in science, but in politics as well, in government, because they were tired of the way things were. So, how was the government structured? What was the way that the government existed prior to all of those changes? Well, we're going to find that out in our next guided notes 8.1, and this is our last guided notes for this quarter and this semester, and we're talking about absolutism, especially in the Islamic caliphates and in Europe, and this is what you're going to learn today. We're going to describe the rise of those absolute Islamic caliphates or empires, especially the Ottoman Turks. And we should be able to compare and contrast those causes and the effects of monarchies, especially a constitutional monarchy in England versus an absolute monarchies in France, Spain, and Russia. Okay. So what exactly is absolutism? So absolutism is the belief that government should exist on a set of principles or rules, and that they should be the same for everyone in all aspects of life. And the person that dictates that is the ruler himself or herself, being a king or queen. So in order for a ruler to be considered absolute, they must be in charge of both religious and political matters. Okay. Now, religious absolutism was when the ruler was responsible for all and any religious decisions, whereas a political absolutist made the rules. Okay, nobody except the ruler, the king or queen, made the rules. Okay, and these absolute rulers that we're going to talk about in this lesson did both. Okay. Now, absolute monarchs became really popular at the beginning of the 17th century, which is the early 1600s, and absolutism, right, started to spread during the 30-year war, which was in Europe between, as you see here, the early 16 to the mid 1600s. And that war was basically a war where Spain was being very militant with their idea of Catholicism and was really pushing it throughout Europe. And many of the monarchies felt that they shouldn't infringe on what they're trying to do, and that they are an established nation, state, or country, and they have nothing to do with what Spain wanted to do. So because of this war, and it was an ongoing war, a long war as you see here, and because of that war and out of the ending of that war, this Treaty of Westphalia took place, and now every nation state was able to have their own ruler, and the treaty also recognized these sovereign countries or sovereign states, where a sovereign country is a country that has the power to govern itself politically and economically. So they have the economic means to be independent and the political means to be completely independent. So with this Treaty of Westphalia from the 30-year war, it grew a sense of what was called modern absolutism. So this is after the Westphalia Treaty. And that Westphalia Treaty's main purpose or its main goal was to prevent wars such as the 30-year war, where other nations or other countries are trying to infringe on what the other country is doing. But it also allowed these monarchs to maintain their power, right, without having that influence on them. Okay, preventing wars such as the 30-year war. So the person that really made, or the king that really made this idea of modern absolutism popular, was this guy here in the fancy robe and tights, King Louis the 14th, and he called himself the Sun King. And the reason why he called himself the Sun King, because he saw himself as the center of everything. So literally, he was the sun, right? So like as we talked about with the heliocentric theory, he saw himself like he was the sun of everything. So there was God and then there was him, right? And we're going to talk more about this idea of where that came from in terms of him seeing himself in that stature. But first, let's get into the rise of the Islamic empires as absolute Islamic empires. So the first absolute Islamic empire, as you see here, was the Ottoman Empire, which was founded by a group of Seljuk Turks. Okay, and they took over the Anatolian Peninsula. That should sound familiar because the Anatolian Peninsula was what empire? So if you said the Byzantine Empire, you're absolutely correct. The Anatolian Peninsula was once the Byzantine Empire. Now they called, when the Ottoman Empire, the Seljuk Turks took over, they called the Ottoman Empire the Gunpowder Empire because they mastered the use of firearms, and through that use of firearms, they were able to build this massive, strong army in the early 14th century, which is the 1300s. Now, two of the sultanates, or the sultans that really brought forth the Ottoman Empire, was Mehmed II, or Mehmed the Conqueror, because he conquered a lot of nations, states, or not of nations. But he also took the Byzantine Empire, or the Byzantine capital, when they took it down. And he changed the name from Constantinople to Istanbul. And that is what the capital of Turkey is today, because Turkey today was once the Ottoman Empire. Okay? And the one to help reach the Ottoman Empire to his peak and massive or greatest extent of power was Suleiman I, also known as Suleiman the Magnificent, and that is this guy with this marvelous sultan's crown, as you see here. So the Safavid Empire was further east, and they were located in Persia, and they rose around the same time of the Ottoman Empire in the 13 to 1400s. But both the Ottoman and the Safavid leaders and the empire was always at odds, because both of them claimed to be the legitimate successor, or the next in line of power, to Muhammad the Prophet. Okay, so because of that, now there was constant fighting between these two empires, the Ottoman and the Safavid Empire. But the Safavid did reach its greatest height of power and extent of power under the rule of the Shah here, Shah Abbas. And here is another empire that was an Islamic absolute empire. This is called the Mughal Empire, okay, or the Mughal Empire. And they moved into India in 1517. It was founded by Babur. Babur is said to be a direct descendant of Genghis Khan. So he felt that he was the rightful person to lead this new empire into power. Now Akbar, as you see here, ruled most of India by the time of his death in 1605. He is known as one of the most prominent emperors for the Mughal Empire. He was only 14 when he took the throne. Imagine, some of you are probably older than 14, but he had an entire empire when he was 14 years old. Akbar was known to practice religious tolerance and is considered one of the empire's greatest rulers because of how progressive he was and how tolerant he was to the Hindus and Muslims that lived or that were there in the Mughal Empire. Aurangzeb took power of the empire from 1658 to 1707. However, he persecuted a lot of Hindus and is considered one of the most controversial rulers in Indian history. But nonetheless, he was still able to bring the Mughal Empire to its greatest height of power and extent of power. Okay? So, in this case, if I figure it out, is it Akbar that was most influential or Aurangzeb that was most influential? Let me know in Edpuzzle and in the comments. So let's talk a little bit about the European Empire. So if you remember, we just talked about King Louis XIV and how he called himself the Sun King because he figured he was the center of everything, right? Well, that idea came from this theory. And the theory was that because King Louis was an absolutist, he felt that rulers should be chosen by God. And because they were chosen by God, or he felt he was chosen by God, that there was no better way to make this choice, and also that he is only responsible to God and no one else. So this is why the royalty in this case was passed down from children to children, or you had successors in royalty. Now, royal queens and the royal family, the kings, they were often referred to divine writers because they believed that they had the right to rule their country by divine right. Now, this term is also called divine right of kings, which is your vocabulary word of divine right of kings. The whole idea, the theory that that rulers, kings, queens, royal families, etc., had the right to rule their country by having God choose them as the only ruler for that country and being responsible to no one else but God. So that's where that idea came from. So there was 3 tenets that was involved in this, tenets being principles. Okay, and this happened mostly in European empires. The first tenet was that a country should be ruled by one set of principles, and those principles came from the ruler and no one else. Okay, so if there was any other ideas or any other theory that another person had to make the country better, now that was probably more than likely shut down, because that was, if it's not aligned with the ruler, then it's no go, right? The next tenet was the state's power should be unlimited, meaning that the country's power, however they want to exercise it, however they wanted to extend it, it was done without restrictions, and no citizen should restrict or go against the idea of the ruler. The royalty had complete control over its country and its citizens. And the last tenet was that the king or queen should not be held accountable for their actions. So they could have committed whatever crime that they committed because, again, by divine right, they were chosen by God. So technically they are forgiven because they can do no wrong. Okay. Remember we talked about in the beginning that there were thinkers that started to challenge things, right? René Descartes, Immanuel Kant, John Locke, Thomas Jefferson. A lot of them started to challenge the way government was looking. They did not like the way absolutism looked and felt, right? So with that challenge and with those constantly questioning the government, many of the rulers, absolute rulers or monarchs, started to move towards an idea of enlightened absolutism. And that is a system in which rulers tried to govern with Enlightenment principles, but they're still trying to maintain their absolute full royal power. Okay? So what Enlightenment principles are we talking about? So some of them, as you see here, like Catherine the Second or Catherine the Great of Russia, they started to implement such ideas as natural rights. So what are natural rights? We're talking about those natural, human, innate, or if you may say God-given rights that were supposed to be given for all people, such as the freedoms that we talk about today: freedom of religion, freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom of petition, freedom of assembly, things like that. They felt that those were natural, or what we call unalienable rights, meaning that you cannot deny them. This is something that as a human you are given and born with. And they felt that rulers such as these monarchs, and only strong monarchs, would be able to bring about these enlightened reforms to the society if they exercise these natural rights. So that's how enlightened absolutism started to come about, and now we see more monarchs that are coming up, especially in places like Russia and Prussia, which is Germany today, right? And other places where they are using enlightenment but also still have a monarchy to govern their societies or their countries. All right, so let's apply it. Here is a quote from Suleiman I, and it says, "The people think of wealth and power as the greatest fate, but in this world a spell of health is the best state. What men call sovereignty is a worldly strife and constant war. Worship of God is the highest throne, the happiest of all estates." So based on this, what is Suleiman's idea of wealth and power? But how does that differ, or how is it different with the idea of absolutism in Europe? Go ahead and give me your thoughts in Edpuzzle or in the comments, and I thank you for listening. And if you can also answer this question based on the lesson that we just learned. Do you think citizens in either the Islamic caliphates or empires, or in Europe with absolute monarchs, do you think that they would still continue to support absolute monarchies? And if so, why? And if not, why not? What's going to happen? What do you think? Let me know, and I will see you in the next lesson. Peace.